Okay, everybody, let's see if the chat is actually working this time. It was messed up, disabled, something. Is the chat, there we go, working. Zach King, he lets me know right away. Excelente. Alrighty, so that just means that I am going to share this with the quickness, but gracias, everybody, for tuning in midweek here on a Tuesday, as we like to say. But I'm going to just share out this link as people start to filter in on this most joyous day. Kind of like Christmas morning when there's a new Stephen King book that just came out. I started listening to a little bit of the audiobook, but I'm not going to be talking Billy Summers at all today. This is strictly Black House, which I had not revisited in some time. And so it was a very, very interesting experience and getting reacquainted with it, because I think when I did the tier list, I was not as kind to this book as much as I enjoyed it upon revisit. And I know we're going to be retinkering the tier list at some particular point soon, which I'm quite excited about, but just making sure everything is golden. All right, Zach King says, unfortunately, I can't stay for the whole episode due to wanting to finish Billy Summers. And I knew that. I knew this was going to be a tough conflict, everybody. Long days and pleasant nights to you as well, Austin. Hail to the king. Amen. Seymour. Gracias. Pops Movie Dungeon says hello. Richard Forrest says, hey, Fuego. Sky. Howdy, y'all. And once I get this shared out, we will get rockin' proper. And yes, I know that this is a commitment to be hanging with me at least for an hour or so right now. But let's I'm extremely appreciative for anybody who wants to take a little bit of time away from Billy Summers. So once I get this link shared, hail to Stephen King, Ka-Tet, we be good, y'all. And I am doubly excited because later tonight, Cecil and I are going to see The Suicide Squad. Got an early screening of that, which we're pretty pumped about. King Shark, he's a shark, right? It seems to be the one that everybody is most pumped about. So, okay, so live ahora. Come join us, as I all too often say. I will not take up any more of y'all's time because I know everybody wants to get back to Billy Summers. So we are good to get rolling. Who else is jumping in? Austin's already asking questions, so I'm going to just start things proper, and then we will get to it accordingly. Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers, along the path of the beam, which we hear a lot about in this particular book. I am known on this level of the tower, which we also hear a lot about in this book, as Jaime and Fuego, and if you're pleased to join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail to Stephen King, and in this case, Peter Straub. That's right, guys, and obviously, bienvenidos and welcome to the horror show. And that's because for its 20th anniversary, yes, this book was published in September. So not quite like correlating with the exact month, but there's a lot of anniversaries in September, and so I had to push this one up just a little bit. We be talking Black Easy. That's right, Black House, and I've still got my Maynard, my Kristopher bookmark in there. So, but yes, I'm very excited to discuss this one today upon my revisit of it because, as I was saying in the pre-roll right before we actually started this episode proper, I had not read this book in probably 6 or 7 years. I was trying to remember if I read it immediately after the Talisman, if I jumped ahead or if I waited. I think I waited, but still, I mean, there was a lot that I don't know if I appreciated as much as now that I've actually finished, the Tower series many years ago at this particular point. But having read 5, 6, and 7 in the Dark Tower series and just seeing how this was a preamble, in some weird way, Black House has actually made me appreciate 5, 6, and 7 a little bit more. I mean, I've really ragged on Song of Susanna a lot, but and also the ending of Dark Tower 7. But nonetheless, revisiting Black House, I don't know if I was very kind to this in the tier list ranking that I did, where we were going decade by decade and just slowly assembling, S, A, B, C, D, F, whatever. But yes, Black House, what a revisit. Let's get to the notes real quickie. But yes, I must say there is a deluxe edition of both this and the Talisman that Grant did, apparently, a number of years ago. I think it was right around the time that Black House was coming out. And I covet you so. Oh, I covet you so. It goes for kind of a pretty penny. But yes, I've got all the notes for this, all the friggin' notes, because man, this book is so dense and there's so much going on, and there's a lot that it just didn't resonate with as much importance in the Tower Saga as it does now, having finished my journey along the path of the beam. So let's see who else has jumped in. So I already said what's up to Zach King. He just briefly popped in because he wants to get back to Billy Summers, and I know that lots of peeps are going to be very, very conflicted. So this was a tough one, being the first Tuesday, the Tower Tuesday of the month, which is when we do these live book of the month things. And so, yes, I know that it's a struggle, and I am so supremely appreciative for anybody that is bopping in for a bit. I already said what's up to Austin, Seymour, Pop's Movie Dungeon, Richard Forrest, Sky. Austin jumps right in with a question and says, how do you think Straub feels about all of the Dark Tower connections? Do you think it overshadowed his writing? That is something that I don't know if it was as apparent to me until my Talisman reread, which I did, like a year or two ago. And then, excuse me. And then also just really getting into the nitty-gritty of this book. And I think it's very apparent in the passages that Straub writes, and then also the King stuff. And I think that King actually took some of these collaborative ideas that he did both with, the Talisman, obviously, back in, 83, 84, whatever it was, and then with this book. And he kind of retrofits it a little bit for the Tower Saga. I think Straub and him are good enough buddies where he's probably cool with it and just happy to have been a part of the process, because I think Straub was actually instrumental in just helping fashion what King ended up doing with the Dark Tower Saga. So that's at least my 2 cents on it, but who the hell knows? They're seemingly still buddies, and we're still waiting for that third entry in the series. And on Wikipedia, it still says the Jack Sawyer trilogy, and yet who knows when/if we'll ever get that third entry and what it would entail, that especially with the Tower Saga being seemingly concluded. I mean, I don't know, could be fun. I would say that King probably has some ideas that have been bopping around in his head for quite a while. So Richard Forrest says, I don't have Billy Summers yet, so it was an easy choice for me. Well, Richard, I am so appreciative that you were here. SK Fan 19 says, long days and pleasant nights, Fuego, and a happy release day, everyone. Amen. As I was saying before we started the show proper, it's like Christmas morning on the day when we get a new Sai King book, and I'm still waiting. Amazon said it's going to be here in my neck of the woods in about an hour, because I've been checking the updates on the app and whatnot. So started a little bit of the audiobook last night, but once again, this is not Billy Summers talk, unfortunately. I am going to crush through it as best I can, and Cecil and I are shooting for a review that non-spoiler tomorrow, so y'all have that to look forward to. Richard Forrest says, planning on getting it eventually, mind you. I would assume no less. Scott Baker, hey, Fuego, listening at work as well. Love Black House. Yeah, Black House, I have, and this seems to happen with all of these rereads when I haven't read a Sai King book in 5, 6, 7 years at this particular point. These revisits have become very fascinating for me, because I have books that I wasn't as just jazzed about upon first read, like Cujo, for instance, and various others. I am finding newfound appreciation specifically. And so that's really dope. I snuck in the club, says Real Eyes Open. SK Fan also says, Black House is in my top 5. I think it is criminally underrated among King. Yeah, and SK Fan 19, that is most definitely a really good place to start, because just some initial observations about this one. I had such an affinity for the Talisman, and that's because I love youthful adventure. I love, fantasy of that nature. I love coming of age stories, and these are all things that King does very well. But besides the coming of age, he doesn't really do a lot of young fantasy adventure sort of stuff. And Talisman is most definitely a young fantasy with some adult horror elements here and there, but not an abundance. And in contrast, Black House is most definitely an adult book. And for that reason, I would totally be if you want your 12-year-old to read, the Talisman, totally cool. I would say there's a few moments that would make them uneasy, perilous stuff, and, death of characters and whatnot. I'm not here to spoil the Talisman or anything, but I wouldn't recommend a 12-year-old reading Black House, man, with some of the themes that it deals with, as adult as it is. And I had kind of forgotten about the essence of the demon-possessed serial killer vibe that we get that we get with this. And I mean, yeah, the fisherman, I remembered that, and I remembered the fact that he killed kids and whatnot, but I guess as time just makes things slip away from, in certain instances, I had forgotten about all of the Albert Fish just connections and about how this was a full-on Albert Fish, like copycat killer of sorts, but in turn possessed by this same, just demonic otherworldly presence, perhaps, that was hinted at, and that I had just kind of forgotten about. So Albert Fish, what a sick fuck, right? I mean, on par with Dahmer, but maybe even worse because of the fact that he ate children. And he's maybe been lost in the annals of serial killer fascination for the sheer fact that, true crime, I know, is such a big thing. And shout out to my buddy Chris Payne, vocalist in Chiron, my band, because of the fact that I produced the first season of something called Profiling Pain, where we went through all kinds of different serial killers. And I know it's like true crime podcasts and specials on Netflix and all that. It's a big fascination. And this is really where I think the big spark that caused King in the following couple of decades, because even this Billy Summers is kind of a true crime sort of thing. Since I haven't gotten far enough, I don't know if we go supernatural with it or whatever, as he eventually went with the Hodges trilogy. But yeah, crime solving and this sort of detective mystery, grisly sort of approach, this is really, I think, that what sparked King's he'd always had an interest in it, but an interest in writing it, I think. And so that's fascinating. But, once again, this is an adult book that I would not recommend for younger readers necessarily, unless they're just like really strong of mind. I mean, teenagers, sure. Well, why the hell not? But like, if you have like a really tough, just astute, smart, loves to read 8, 10, 11, 12-year-old, I don't know. If I was a parent, I would be hesitant and would not necessarily be super cool with that. But then again, I had friends that were watching Nightmare on Elm Street when they're like 4 or 5 years old. So to each their own. But myself, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a book for like young readers. So yeah, let's see what other peeps are saying. Austin says, I think an H.H. Holmes killer would be fitting with the house theme, not nearly as disturbing. No, true that. I can give some credence there. And, another initial impression upon this reread observation is that the Talisman feels so episodic, if that makes sense. And that's why I'm really disappointed that they didn't get to do all of those comic series, because of the fact that, it was like one kind of contained adventure after another. And granted, in the Talisman, they all interconnected, but they all did have kind of that, I mean, where, he was being held hostage at the tap room, and then when him and Wolf were in the group home. And so there were these kind of contained little mini adventures within the entirety of the saga. Whereas this one feels more like Black House is like a full-on straight narrative sort of situation, in my opinion. It's more of a straight through line kind of thing. And so that's something that, since it had been, I'm so far removed from having read this. This is only my second time reading Black House, by the way. And so, yeah, it was interesting to get just that reminder about the structuring and how there is that kind of directly different approach. And also, I think King and Straub had, changed a lot as writers over this. As I said, it was either 83 or 84. I'm trying to recall correctly for Talisman. And then we push forward to 2001 and September 15th of 2001 to be approximate. And so the second pairing with Straub and King, obviously, this was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. Unfortunately, it did not win, but I always read and then listen as well in 2 separate little instances over the course of the month. And it was cool to hear Frank Mueller, I think it's Mueller, but he's the guy who also narrates the Talisman as well. So it's cool to hear that familiar face and just have that voice connectivity and consistency. I think it does go a long way in just the listening experience, which is pretty dope. Blue is on. Blue, what is up? Long days, pleasant nights, and happy King release day. Hope you're doing well, sir. You say, I like Black House better than Talisman. I've seen more and more people saying that. Shout out to myself and Lady Catherine's friend, Renee Hubbard. She actually said that she finally read Black House for the first time, and she preferred it. It's most definitely, like, if you're a Tower junkie, I think you will most definitely prefer Black House in a lot of ways, because it is so much darker, so much more grim in its storytelling. And this is full on, like, I guess it before King wrote 4.5, this would have most definitely been considered like Dark Tower 4.5, or maybe, 4.7 or something like that, if we're going to get, very meticulous with our decimals and such. But okay, he says, sorry, I can't stick around to hate on me. Happy Billy Summers Day, Blue. Thank you so very much. And long days and pleasant nights to you, sir. Austin continues to say, I don't mean to disrespect Straub, but I really couldn't stand his second person passage if it didn't really flow for me. It worked for me a lot more in this second instance, but I think you can really tell, as I believe I said earlier, the difference in prose and the approach. And there is this kind of sentient narrator that's like just kind of floating around throughout the town and, jumping from person to person and just observing situations and describing them. I think the first time I read this, I was not as into it as I was this particular time. I did appreciate it a whole lot more. And Straub is a very talented writer. It's just his style sticks out so significantly differently than when you can tell King is writing. So, okay. Tower Junkie here says Seymour Toa. And then Viangon 1972. I also preferred Black House to Talisman too. I'm seeing this more and more as an opinion. I don't know if I would go that far at this particular point, but they're really neck and neck and such drastically different books in my estimation. It really is like, a child versus a grown-up. And some people have those more adult tastes and preferences and stuff like that. You want something scarier. You want something way more messed up. And this book is obviously way, way more messed up. And especially if you're a Tower Junkie, I mean, just the extent of the connections. Now, some of the references which amuse me, where the cops are talking early on and they're bickering about, he's like, you like corn and 311, and the kids are collecting magic cards. And I still remember I was a lot older at that point, but I was still playing magic cards when I was in high school and so on and so forth. And, sit around and I probably wasn't old enough to drink, but I remember having lots of smoke and drink sessions and playing extended sessions of magic carding. So anyway, what else we got? Fuego. Many things. I'm just trying to finish up the overall thoughts. But, what Austin just mentioned, I think is a really, really good springboard, because the book does begin, and it is very much whereas the Talisman was obviously granted, Traveling Jack goes across the country, both through our world, Keystone, and then, the territories, obviously. But whereas that started out in, back in New Hampshire and New England, which is King's stomping grounds, this book is most definitely Peter Straub's love letter to his home state of Wisconsin. And yes, he does like retitle certain places and whatnot, but it is really between the sports fandom, with the Brewers and, the Badgers and all this different stuff. I mean, it is very, and also just this description of the lush landscape and how he just describes it with such just love and affinity. And it's very much Straub's love letter, as I said. And that's where I think that's why Straub, kind of covered that sort of stuff, description of everything from, the Black House to the surrounding, like, spoiled forests and all that different stuff. And then I would say King probably handled the predominance of the dialogue and, some of the more straightforward narratives. But King's stuff, I do think, has a different sort of flow in this particular tale, which I do personally prefer. But yeah, in this intensive introduction, to this town of drastically diverse people, which, King loves his town of just very diverse, odd, specific, and well-defined individuals. We get that initially, but I feel like we get to know them a little bit more when they are actually having dialogue with each other, as opposed to just this ghostly floating around sort of thing that we get at the very beginning, as we are initially introduced to a vast cast of characters, this Thunder 5 biker gang that work at this local brewery. What else? I mean, the frustrated cops that are just so aggravated and humiliated about not being able to catch this fisherman killer. And you've got, multi-personality DJs, blind no less, of like 3 different sort of alter egos. And then you've got these asshole journalists, and you've got this asshole journalist. You've got a crooked elderly folks home. What else? Many more unaware of this slippage that is taking place in this borderland. And so it's interesting how I believe Straub took some of the ideas of like thinnies and overlapping stuff. I mean, things that King had introduced in the Dark Tower series. And granted, a lot of it, as I said, was defined from him working along with Straub from the Talisman. But King just ran off and went with it. And perhaps maybe Straub did want to kind of reel it back in and make it a little bit more his. And I do like the discussion of the slippage, though, and how the slippage and like the dark degradation of a specific spot happens within these borderlands where, if you're going to use more King speech, these like overlapping, almost like thinny sort of places, because the Black House is really a thinny, over into Endworld and stuff. And so it's interesting in that regard, but I really do think that Straub wanted to make some aspect of his own, take it back, take the power back, if we're going to make the Rage reference. And so Visions of the Eye of the Crimson King and various other elements there. There are a couple different people, most notably Judy, boy, I'm trying to remember her last name, basically the mother of this boy who wants I believe it's Judy Marshall, if I remember correctly. But nonetheless, there are people besides our hero, Jack Sawyer, who has grown up and who has forgotten all about his time, going through the territories and saving his mother. Anytime the thought kind of comes to him, he's like, no, those are just dreams. And I imagined that I saved my mother. And so he's repressed everything. He went on to become this astute, just well-celebrated and decorated detective in Los Angeles, because after his mother came back, they obviously, went back to California, and she lived a great deal longer and ended up passing away eventually, obviously. But yeah, he grows up, becomes this he has almost like the touch, Sixth Sense-y kind of thing. And yes, I know that we even touched upon that way back during my Talisman review and any sort of coverage. And he's one of various characters that, young and all grown up, I guess you could probably even see some connections between young Danny Torrance and in Dr. Sleep, and then, Jack, and then grown up in this particular book. But he gets a reminder of his old life, and it sparks within him when he happens to see, none other than Speedy Parkus, his buddy that helped him jump over into the territories in the initial book. He sees him when he's driving around at this crime scene that he isn't a part of. He's just gone through a breakup with his then current girlfriend, and it sparks within him recollections of the stuff that actually happened that he has just pushed away into the back of his brain and tried to deny and everything. And yes, he's just like, can't do this shizzle anymore. I've got to peace out. And he actually helped solve a case in Wisconsin. And this guy, Dale, the chief over there that he had struck up a friendship with, he had said to him, after assisting with that case, somebody who had fled from Wisconsin over to Los Angeles, he's like, yo, if you ever find some property over in this beautiful land of Wisconsin, once again, Straub just, declaring his just love and admiration for his home state, even though he lives in New York City now and has for quite a while. But, you never forget where you grew up and just your love and admiration, as I said. So, Sawyer is like, hey, if you ever find the property, I would definitely be down to get it. He ends up purchasing said property, and then shortly thereafter has incident seeing a presumed dead Parkus. And then he's like, okay, peace out, relocates, quits, and he's living in western Wisconsin and just chilling, living the good life in this place that he considers more beautiful than any other that he had seen. And that's where we join our narrative in July of 2001 on a brisk and just invigorating and yet decaying Friday morning. So let's see what some other peeps are saying right now, because I saw Seymour said, okay, wants to peek at your Sai King notebook notes. I've got a whole huge fatty book of them after 5+ years of doing this show. Austin says, the only real problem I have with the novel is it seems like the Dark Tower series is required reading if you want to fully understand this story. I think you can gain some appreciation from it and you can enjoy it, but without having read it. But seriously, you will get so much more out of this, especially it's like the end of the second part of the book, right before we're about to start the third act, when he finally goes over to the territories and he meets Sophia. He has his palaver with Parkus, and Parkus basically explains everything about the current situation to him and talks some high speech and, explains the nature of the broken beams and the breakers. And he basically like spoon feeds him. So it's basically like a crash course for anybody who has not read the Dark Tower stories. And they're just like, oh, Black House, cool. I read the Talisman. Or even some people who hadn't read the Talisman in 2001, they were probably like, oh, Black House, that's a ominous sort of title. I'll pick that book up. But yeah, Austin, very similar to in the third act of Insomnia. I think that you would get a little lost, but he does at least explain things well enough. But yeah, you're not going to get anywhere near as much satisfaction and enjoyment out of this particular book unless you have indeed read up to that point within the Tower series. And as I said, I have a little bit more appreciation for not only this book, but also for 5, 6, and 7 after this revisit. Now, I'm not saying I like 6 and 7 that much, but I appreciate certain aspects a little bit more. And I definitely like this book a whole lot more upon a revisit. Austin also chimes in and says, I read it before Dark Tower, and after rereading the series, Black House makes much more sense. Totally. Yep. This, Insomnia, and portions of Hearts in Atlantis, most notably Low Men, the first story, because Brodigan is mentioned in this as being, the top breaker. And yeah, that's the thing. I really believe that you could take away all the Tower elements from this. And I have said this about Insomnia, that much like what they did with the Hearts in Atlantis film, I think you could take those deep dive Tower connections away, and you could still have a story here about a supernatural serial killer who has a demon that has gone from sick fuck to sick fuck, like generation after generation, from Albert Fish to somebody else like a Dahmer, for instance. And then in turn, you get this guy, you get old Bernie, Chummy Burnside, or whatever the hell his name was, who also went by a different alias back when he was in Chicago doing horrible things there. So you could streamline this, I think, and make it into, it still would probably need to be, a limited series, but I think you could make this into a limited series and not have to have the Tower connections, and it would still make sense. I mean, let's say you just go into the haunted house at the end to confront said demon, as opposed to jumping into End World and having to go through all that stuff. I like all that stuff. I mean, but that's because I'm a Tower junkie and I like all those connections. So be it as it may, let's continue on. Obviously, Murderous Fisherman, he was essentially Albert Fish. Know that. He's a copycat, Mr. Burnside. The grotesque description, though, of the surrounding woods, the Black House itself, and then the nasty diner where Straub, I'm assuming, is writing this portion, because it's that same descriptive prose that we get with that ghostly sentient narrative, like narrator of sorts. And so where he's just describing the degradation, the slippage as he describes it, and to just, it's really gross when you get to the gnawing of the foot and the girl. I mean, there is very disgusting and unsettling description of the murder of these kids and what was done to them, and just the dining on the flesh and all that. I mean, Straub and King really went for it. Those portions I still think were more so Straub, and I haven't read any Straub. That's the thing. I've had recommended to me Coco, A Ghost Story, a few others. So I've been thinking about reading him. So if anybody has read any Straub and wants to chime in with recommendations, or if he's even really that much worth my time with everything else that I have to read, from my Star Wars books to comics and various other things, I don't know. Definitely chime in and give some thoughts there if at all possible. But yeah, just the description of this dilapidated diner, and just the grossness of the guy who used to run the operation and how unsanitary everything was. But yeah, it's interestingly descriptive, and yet it doesn't flow quite like King stuff. Just to circle back to that, everybody. So yes, I already mentioned the death of Speedy and the clearing of the clouds, and the clouds of Jack Sawyer's amnesia, so to speak. One thing that I do want to chime in with real quick, though, is that I found it interesting that we have this. We have to have some place where our senile serial killer is present, right? But that subplot of the chipper guy who basically is running the place, and he's skimming off the top and screwing over all of these elderly folks and stuff, and he's diddling his assistant and all that. It's so incredibly minor that I don't even necessarily know if that subplot was ultimately necessary, but yet it is there. This is a book that, very similar to The Talisman, I think an editor could have had a field day with trimming down a significant amount of it. This could have easily lost maybe 100 pages or so, and a few of those subplots, like the Strawberry Festival, like where the town freaks out when the crime scene is finally revealed at the nasty diner that I was just discussing, and word spreads like wildfire. And it's like the telephone game. It goes viral, as we would say, because this one cop happens to go and call his wife, and then his wife tells two of her friends, and then it spreads throughout the entire town. And it is such an extended portion of just everybody just descending upon this, including the biker gang, where their leader has he was one who had a child killed by this fisherman, and so. And then you also have that Wendell journalist asshole who's just like pouring gasoline on the fire with his inflammatory just sort of coverage of it, the sensationalist journalist sort of approach. And that is one thing that I will definitely say is these characters are incredibly intriguing for the most part. All of the ones that we get to really know, like, the leader of the biker gang, whose name is eluding me at this particular point, but also Doc and Mouse, who we get to know a little bit. Those are the three main peeps in the biker gang. And then also our blind DJ, who is buddies with Jack Sawyer. I really enjoyed their relationship. And Henry he was cool, man, from the fact that he'd adjusted to living as a blind man so incredibly, from running all of this recording equipment and having three alter egos and slickly dressed and all of that. I mean, he's a really cool character, and it's a fascinating friendship and just very endearing. King loves his like older and just like a fatherly or grandfatherly type figure with a younger character, and so once again, we have that sort of thing going down with Jack Sawyer and Henry, and it's pretty cool. But that's where the book, in my estimation, starts to significantly stall, is just the extensive aspect of that whole descending upon the crime scene and Wendell being an asshole and all that stuff. That's where the middle of this book is where I think some significant trimming could have gone down. And also the Strawberry Dance, I mentioned that already. The dream of Parkus talking the tower. Yep, we already mentioned that too. The repression of what really happened. I do like the Queen of the Bees connection in the fact that we do have bees in the third act that essentially assist Jack and his Ka-Tet of sorts in just finally being able to kind of solve the riddle of getting into the Black House. And so if there's any beats or particular moments, guys, because I'm just kind of, I've given overall thoughts, and now I'm just kind of cruising through parts of the narrative that I think worked and parts that I didn't necessarily think worked. So chime through if you have any specifics. And okay, SK Fan says, spoiler, the scene where Jack goes to the house after his buddy is killed, feels a presence there. That part always creeped me out. And there are some significantly creepy parts in the back half of this, and I will certainly be getting to those pretty quickly. But okay, this is a quote that I really enjoyed. When you're 12, the mind and body are more elastic. And this is after Jack finally flips, because he was reluctant to even be a part of the investigation, which I still find kind of strange because of the fact that he's such a virtuous character and he did so much good back in Los Angeles. The fact that he had such a reluctance and unwillingness to assist in, and the fact that he knows how sharp and how much aid and help and insight he could actually impart into this case, and still didn't want to do it. And I think it was probably because of those connections and the fact that he was starting to, have those like waking dreams and the sparrow egg showing up and, the feather and all, and like the reminders were starting to come. And perhaps that's why he was having so much of an issue. But yeah, he kind of takes you long enough, man, especially after Ty gets kidnapped and things just really escalate in that regard. And Dale is just like, come on, man, help me. And the fact that he needed so much coercion and just like arm twisting is, I don't know, it's kind of nuts in that regard. I have to say, I found it relatively strange. And yet he does finally get on board, and he does eventually, after finally flipping over for the first time, he's like, oh, that's right. I've been here before, and it's all coming back to me now. And that's exactly how it kind of goes down for him, which is cool. But yeah, and in the fact that, the mind and the body are more elastic, and the fact that, you're just willing to kind of bend and go with the flow a little bit. And it's the loss of imagination in a lot of ways, in my opinion, that kind of forces adults to just kind of close their minds a little bit. They get into routines. They get tired of just trying to expand their mind and trying to think outside of that proverbial box. It really is kind of a sad situation in that regard. But yeah, man. And also this perfectly epitomizes the scene that I had mentioned a short time ago, where they find the crime scene and just the entire town descends upon the place. Gossip is no doubt nasty stuff, but it does energize the human spirit. And obviously you blame the Mad Hungarian for that, but yeah, there's so much truth to that, unfortunately, especially in these smaller towns where so little is actually going down. And that's why there is this inclination to just gossip and talk about everybody and, behind one another's backs and, oh, so-and-so's diddling so-and-so, or yeah, I saw, he's back and, buying more booze, or he's so-and-so smoking again, whatever the hell vice or thing that wants to be hidden may be, nasty secrets like this. And it's really especially sad because Dale and the police force in French Landing, I believe is what the place was called, in, Coolie Country. There's so much frustration about the fact that they're trying to get the coroner over. They're trying to keep it contained so there isn't this mass hysteria and this whole just freakish freak out of just everybody. I don't know, the proverbial Wendell pouring the gasoline on the fire that we get, which is cool, cruel, absolutely cruel, because it just makes people more upset. And yet that's, it's what you get in those tabloids, in those hey, professional publications do it too. So I'm not going to really give that sort of distinction in comparison. So I'm going to take a sip of the water. Huzzah, everyone. And jump over to this next page. Yeah. So Dale is on the hot seat throughout a good chunk of this because of the fact that he knows that the state and also feds are kind of breathing down his neck, because he doesn't just want the credit necessarily. He wants to salvage his reputation and look like he is a cool, confident, and capable, chief of this small town. And he's like, man, I haven't really, and that's why he's just begging Jack Sawyer to assist him. But yes, after the just alleged incompetence just reaches a fever pitch, that's when the state cops come in, and they're just like, it's very similar to the South Park episode where the local cops are being superseded, and they're like, this investigation is now under our jurisdiction. And there's the response of the local cops, and they're like, but that's not fair. And it's the exact vibe that you get. Now, granted, that's me just kind of poking fun a little bit, but it is that similar sort of dynamic where you want to do it for the community because you're much more closely and personally connected. And yet, Dale was at the mercy of the situation without the eventual insight that we get when Jack Sawyer comes on board. Another term, which is interesting because it shows up during the spelling bee portion where they find out this girl can't spell Opapanax, I think it is. And in this weird, I guess it's their dictionary description, where it's a word, like the description in the dictionary is of a word that is undefined, but yet it also has a second meaning, at least in this particular level of the tower. And it essentially jumps into a dark and kind of formidable mystery, and something that you're having issues with solving. And, it's just very formidable in that regard. So, yeah, but also if you look in our world, it's a plant that is turned into some sort of oil, I think, and it originates in Somalia, and it's been sold since ancient times. So I don't know. In our world, Opapanax is something completely different. But so interesting discussion about travel at the psych ward. And this is where it starts to really rev up in the second act, where the mother, Judy Marshall, I believe it is, yeah. So the mother of Tyler, this kid who's been kidnapped. Tyler, excuse me. She starts talking about other worlds and with Jack, and they sit down and they have this palaver because she has been admitted into this ward, and she was having premonitions about the fact that, just a very slight bit of the touch, she knew that her son was going to be taken by the fisherman. And she's mumbling stuff early on about the Eye of the Crimson King and, towers and stuff like that. But even Tyler has this poster of this like castle tower thing in his room. So there were various hints about the abilities of not only this woman, but even more so her posterity, her progeny. And so that's where she kind of confides in Jack Sawyer when her husband brings him to visit. See if you can peer into her mind and her psyche in some particular state. And she mentions that on the other side of this wall, she had communicated with a girl that it's almost like her. It's obviously her twinner, I believe it's twinner if I recall correctly. But yeah, Twinnie Cooper, that's right. But yeah, the fact that she had a similar situation to various others, between her other place, as she called it, her faraway. That's how she essentially described the territories. But she has this counterpart named Sophie, and she had been hearing her and communicating with her since she was a kid. But there was almost like there was a wall between the two of them, and they were trying to talk to each other, but it was difficult because of that sense of separation. And so that when she has this palaver with Jack, that's what really sets into motion him finally going over, because they have two instances of it. But that's where she really just kind of makes him accepting of jumping over and trying to see if there's any sanctity and insight that he can bring back. And lo and behold, that's exactly what transpires. And I dig that part, man. I mean, and also the fact that Jack Sawyer finds himself like slightly attracted to this woman who is married and very, very happily married too. And her husband is really painted to be this very good dude. And so that's where it's a little bit strange in that regard that he's starting to fall for her. But then when Jack finally does, in fact, cross over and meets her twinner, her counterpart, who I guess she had seen him when he was going through the pavilions in the original book in the Talisman. So it is kind of one of those when they finally do see each other. It's like a love at first sight sort of bit. And it's cute in that regard. But yeah, when Jack comes back and they're having kind of this Mac-down feel-up session, and Wendell, the journalist who's hiding in the closet trying to, I'm in the closet too. When he sees them just going to town on each other, it's a very amusing moment because he's like Hollywood is trying to, rape this, sexually assault this mental patient. And she's just like, no, it's fine, whatever. But yes. That when we get to the second act, though, I believe it is, that's when the fog brings the madness. And that's where, this is where, once again, where the middle portion of this, it does stall just a wee bit. And so before I kind of jump into that, I've only got another page and a half or so, but nonetheless, I think before I jump into the framing and everything that transpires once the fog rolls in, let's see what everybody else has said. Austin says Henry. Okay, no, never mind. Okay, Danny Blazin says, good books. Been a while in Black House. I remember the characters putting Vicks Vapor Rub under their noses before entering the house, a scentful and psychological shield to the horrors within. Well, if I remember correctly, Jack says that when they were on the scene in with a dead corpse in LA and they didn't want to actually smell it, he said that that's what they used to use. But when they go into the Black House, they put the honey on, and that's what actually allows them, because of the bee connection and, the queen of the bees. And and bees, they say, think back to what Einstein said, and the fact that if the bees finally die out completely, we're pretty much done as a species. And so that sort of just importance to their existence, and it's kind of a dueling double connection, between the fact that Jack's mother was the queen of the bees, and then the fact that it is bees that help them, bees and what they create, the honey, obviously, that's what allows them to actually enter the structure, this horrible kind of pinpoint, this thinny, so to speak. What else we got? Only read Yeah, we can show that. I don't know why it's hiding the comment. Only read 2 other Straub books, Shadowland and Floating Dragon, yet to complete. Both very fucking spooky. Okay, I'm screen capturing that right now, so I do not forget, because yes, I'm quite curious there. Danny Blazin, thanks for the recommendation, because I don't have a lot besides the aforementioned Coco and Ghost Story that I've had people tell me about. Austin Bonnell says, also, I like the fact that Jack forgetting about the territories is similar to the Losers Club forgetting about Darian Pennywise. Very, very good point. It's that whole growing up and, you know, the elasticity of youth, like we were just pointing out. Yeah, it's interesting how as we age, the memory of youth fades, and the aspect of imagination and everything, and just the belief in the possibility of the fantastical and there being other worlds than these. That's what is so fascinating, and yet it happens. I'm glad that I kept journals and wrote songs and all this different stuff, because there are certain instances from my youth that I'll think about, and I'm just like, yeah, that's how it happened. That's how it went down. And then I go back and I consult something from that particular year. I'm just like, ooh, it's a little bit different than I recall. And sometimes, you know, sometimes there are things that when I look back 10, 15 years ago, a song I wrote, or, you know, a poem, or just a journal entry or whatever, it's things that I had completely forgotten about. So it's something that King explores in a fascinating fashion, is just that loss, how, you know, things do in fact just fade away. It's a very melancholy sort of thing, and I've talked about it extensively with regards to it in any time that I've gone into that. But yeah, so the fog rolls in after, you know, the whole fracas at the crime scene, and this is where Bernie gets a little bit more. He's really trying to get Peeps off of his scent, and for that reason, he goes into this really dilapidated, shitty motel where it's like an extended stay sort of place where, you know, Peeps can live without having to go into an old folks home. You can die on a fixed income, they say in the book at one particular point. And he essentially goes in there and frames this other guy who he had a Chicago connection with, because, you know, Chummy Burns, he had Chummy Bernie or whatever his nickname was. He was a sick son of a bitch all the way back into Chicago. He was supposed to be on trial for murder. It was like a double murder, because he had killed some kids out there too. And yet he relocated, he escaped or something, and then he relocated and changed his identity and was somehow able to end up in this old folks home. But yeah, this old, like, kind of rival of his from Chicago, he finds out living in the same, you know, area of Western Wisconsin in this oh God, I just keep forgetting the French landing. Yeah. But yeah, so he goes and he plants those photographs, they frame him, and this is the second instance where the town gets all if you've ever watched South Park, man. It's the second time that it happens, and I just don't know if we needed both of those instances happening of the town. Now, I guess it's a little bit different in this particular instance because of the fact that they are led by a girl who, well, not a girl, a mother who has become this, like, super drunk, and her daughter was another one of the victims of fishermen. And so when they think they have the killer, because these photos are planted and they're discovered by one of his neighbors in the motel, taken into custody, and another just lynch mob, terrible, shows up and wants to, they're just like, let him loose so we can disperse our own justice. And that's what they are just adamant about doing. And yet being led by a ringleader who reminds me very much of the villainous woman who just mobilizes everybody in the mist, at least in this particular instance. But yeah, she has had her mind clouded and is essentially under control by this Grog. And Grog, this is where I got to get deep, Tower Junkie peeps. For most of the book, and yet I'm not 100%, and I've debated this with other Tower Junkies and friends and stuff like that, the fact that she, I'm trying to remember her name, I wrote it down here, Tansy. Tansy essentially believes that this is a raven that comes to see her. And she even starts thinking of, lines from Edgar Allan Poe's book, or what? I guess it's kind of a poem. It's a lengthy poem, being the raven and everything. So this large crow that comes to see her, and that has also been, dispersing nastiness at various points, interacting with Bernie, and yet there is a deeper, darker force connected in End World than what Munchin or Mansion. He's Lord Manchi. God damn it! Why can't I remember? Because he essentially has two different sort of aliases, but. Yeah, in any event, we'll get to it. But yeah, so Grog, or Gorg. Why am I saying Grog? Gorg, which means death, essentially translates that as such into the high speech, is the one that's. We got peeps. Mess says, "Hey guys, Scott Baker, got to bail for now. Always a pleasure listening to Discuss King. Long days and pleasant nights, sir." Scott, to you as well. Thanks very much for jumping on for a little bit. I know these extensive discussions can drag along, so thank you for making your workday a part of mine, sir. So greatly appreciated there. But yeah, so Tansy, she encounters the Gorg, this crow, this oversized crow that I personally, based on the fact that, Flag took that form in the stand, I kind of got the vibe of sorts that, it was in fact him being this mischievous thing and just kind of messing and, overshadowing. But then once again, there is that deeper, crazier presence of Mr. Munston, but then it's Lord Munstad, or I don't know. It goes by a different affiliation once we really pull the curtain back and find the full extent of the power and the Abala connection in the third act. So, but so she is essentially under the power of Gorg, and she leads this mob, and it's an interesting scene. But once again, it's stuff along with the previous crime scene frenzy that I don't know how ultimately necessary it is to the narrative. Similar to what I said about the old folks' home that what's his face was running, and I guess really for them it was just for Bernie to eventually kill the leader, the head of the old folks' home, and then his woman assistant he had been diddling. But so I don't know. This is an area where you do get some interesting stuff when the grieving, boozing mother, she gets ravened, is what I said here. That's kind of funny. But again, leads the mob. But she is the conflict is averted when some of those lilies from the territories that Speedy actually leaves for Jack kind of set stuff into motion. And that's something that I also forgotten, how Jack finally at least jumps over for that first brief time. And this is where it was just borrowing a page right from Albert Fish, in the fact that sending limbs to the victims or to interested parties, and the fact that he gets that New Balance shoe, and that's what kind of finally sends him into the frenzy that takes him over that first time very briefly to the territories. But yeah, what a sick son of a bitch, I swear. And yet the fact that we have the counterbalance of Parkus, who Jack eventually gets over to see, and the fact that he had left those lilies for him, it diffuses this conflict. And without Tansy, the ringleader, things just kind of fizzle down. And yes, Potsy, the false accused killer, who everybody was going to kill, he reveals to Jake who built the Black House and just the nature of the force dwelling, in the vicinity of that area. And you find out it was Bernie's house, which was even crazier. And the fact that, it was so dilapidated, and that when people were working on it, there was no shadow cast, and there was like numbness and tingling. I mean, just the emanating presence of evil that is described here is greatly fascinating to me. And yet, Potsy has it for a second and clues Jack into it, and then he just kind of slips away. And so it's stuff. There's most definitely like random and purpose going down here, and there is forces at work trying to just cloud these memories of people. So it is Ka works in both ways for both good and evil, as they say later in this book, and it is most definitely a thing. After the discussion with the dazed Tansy, it becomes clear that the territories and End World are other worlds than each other. This is not something that I remembered. So I thought that the territories were just kind of an extension, and yet they're not, as is clarified in this, because in the back half of this book is where all of the explanation really starts to make sense. The territories are essentially like another bordering, like very similar sort of place to Midworld and Endworld and whatnot, but it's not quite the same. So there is, but yet since all of the crazy shit that Abala, Crimson King, is trying to do is spreading to all worlds, and the infinite amount of worlds as the high speech, which I remember, Dafan, worlds beyond telling, because at one particular point, Jack Sawyer is like, it's like, how many worlds are there? And they're like, there's an infinite amount of them. And yet what the Crimson King is trying to do with breaking all the beams and the destruction of the tower so he can get that chaos, yeah, I mean, everybody would be affected. And so, yes, the territories and Endworld, they're not quite the same. And there's also a little bit of explanation about, okay, so if that was the case, how was Roland able and the Little Sisters of Eluria to walk through the dilapidated pavilion and have, the sisters and all that other stuff? And there is some explanation about the fact that it's almost like a traveling medical tent of sorts. So it can kind of go from world to world. So yes, the territories that I had forgotten about this clarification, territories and, Roland's world are not quite the same. They are neighboring worlds, but they are in fact different. So I found that fascinating, and I appreciated that clarification, even if I very much did want them. They're probably like twinner worlds to a degree, because of the fact that, the blasted lands and, slow mutants and all that different stuff. So there are direct similarities, just like there are direct similarities to Keystone, which is, well, I guess it's probably not Keystone. It's just another version of Earth that Jack Sawyer dwells in. But nonetheless, the fact that there are worlds that are very similar, almost mirrors of one another, with just those slight differences, just like the Topeka, for instance, that they end up in Dark Tower 4. And yet there's also worlds that are so drastically different, as you also have clarified for you, and that are filled with just, I mean, we're talking Lovecraft level creatures of the most frightening variety, a la Crouch End. So that is something cool to keep in mind. The eerie conversation with the bikers tripping on the ultimate, and that's a cool scene where you find out about the death of little Nancy, the girlfriend of one of the bikers. And once we really got to get to know the whatever 5 is they're calling them, I'm trying to remember, the Thunder 5 biker gang. Once we got to really know those peeps, I really grew to enjoy those characters. I appreciated the hell out of them. And what ends up going down as they actually, because they find out, at least they think they know where the Black House is, because when they're tripping on those drugs, what's-his-face says that he had actually been out there. Mouse, I think, was the guy. And so they, even though Jack Sawyer tells them, hold up and wait, and I'm going to go with you because I can probably protect us to some degree, they're impetuous. They head out there anyway. And what happens to them once they get close to the Black House, because I don't even think they get close to it, but the crazy attack that goes down and how Mouse gets chewed up by this like Hound of the Baskervilles like thing, and just the nastiness that it sends seeping into his body in the aftermath. It's a very frightening scene. It's very coolly written, and it's one of my favorite beats in the entire book. So I had to give a shout out to that. I already mentioned the Little Sisters reference, and Jack flipping over, having his palaver with Parkus, and this is definitely where the book finally, as I mentioned earlier, shifts into like full-blown Dark Tower mode, man. And hearing about the Crimson Kings, the nature of the Breakers, the Dark Tower, and also the Dintat, the furnace of chaos that the Crimson King essentially wants to transpire. This, like, Parkus explains things so well about how the Crimson King can be in 2 places at once, how he can be in a cage at the top of the Dark Tower, but yet also be in the court of the Crimson King, like the King Crimson song. And so I appreciate the very condensed explanation, because, this would be a really good primer for somebody. Granted, I mean, the Crimson King doesn't really get properly explained and elaborated upon until you get to like Insomnia. And, this book really gives a little bit more insight, as opposed to, the predominance of Flag and all that stuff like you get in like 3 and, 4 and so on and so forth. So good stuff there. And also the revelation that Tyler Marshall, the kidnapped kid, is potentially the most powerful breaker that could be, even more so than Brodigan. So it's fascinating, man. It really, really is. More so than anything, as Austin said, to shout out Austin one more time, in the fact that, yes, if you're a Tower junkie, you will get so much more out of this book in every possible capacity. And, Rama Abala and Mr. Munsten. And this is where you really get the proper distinction about the fact that Gorg was just kind of an emissary that was assisting this Mr. Munsten that has been kind of taking over the body of Bernie, but had also taken over the body of various others, including all of those decades ago Albert Fish, and has a taste for this human flesh, but is like one of the just high in the court of the Crimson King, essentially, and has been assisting for quite a while. And this is where we get the full nature of what is going down with all of these kids being taken, and how some that have no ability are chowed down on and discarded. Those that are believed to have a potential of ability, and this is the aspect that I did not remember, having been so far removed from this book. I forgot that the kids that are essentially at work in this the big I'm trying to remember the big combination. I had forgotten that they were separate from the breakers. They're essentially like all of these kids that they're attempting to rescue. They're like failed breakers. So they had an ability, but they weren't strong enough to be like full on breakers. They definitely weren't like a Tyler or a Sheemy or a Brodigan or the various others that actually made their way that far into Endworld. And so I had forgotten about that distinction, and how the big combination is essentially it's all these kids that I remember the slaving away and the toiling and the lizards whipping them and all that stuff. But I had forgotten about the fact that they're like sending, waves of like discordia and stuff out throughout all of the worlds, trying to cause fear and havoc and just essentially sending out evil beacons of craziness. And so I'm glad that upon this revisit, I got to really just nail down that distinction, because there are aspects of the Dark Tower lore that are just very intriguingly just laid out. And once again, this is where, to Austin's credit, a lot of people would not know and just be like in way over their heads. They're just like, what? There's a monorail that goes to Endworld, and there were two others, Blaine and Patricia, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and yet they both went crazy. And so there are so many Easter eggs in this story. Like there's just an insane abundance of them for Tower Junkies. And then you've even got cool references to like Rose Red in the description of just Black House and being an evil house with like just resounding just presence of evil. But obviously Black House like dwarfs in every possible capacity this particular Black House, the Rose Red home. But nonetheless, cool shizzle, man, cool shizzle. Mouse's demise, though, after getting that bite, is really horrifying, and one of the just grossest bits in this, probably right along with the description of the dog just chewing on the foot, like I was talking about at the abandoned diner. The fact that his skin is like peeling off, and this black goo is like oozing out of his fingers and his eyes, and he is trying so desperately to tell Jack where the Black House is so he can actually get to it with his little posse that he ends up putting together and infiltrate it. And he's like decomposing like right there. We are legitimately talking like melting like into like this blobby gelatinous status. And he's like, yeah, when I'm done, probably just flush me down the drain or the toilet or whatever. And it's sad, man. Sad, because I really, really dig his character. Him and Doc and the leader, Beezy, God damn it, I'm trying to remember his name. But nonetheless, the fate of that guy is horrifying, and yet he gets enough information, even though Jack is like, yeah, I could probably get there myself at this particular point. And he rushes over there with the quickness trying to get there, and Beezer is like just like berating him for not being available instantaneously. But peeps, nonetheless, we're basically in the third act at this particular point. And the smell of blood is most definitely like laughter. And once again, Henry is such a fascinating character, from Symphonic Stan to his other alter egos. Oh goodness, I know the Wisconsin Rat, and what the heck was the other one? That's George Rathbun, who you meet like right away in the book, because he's this sportscaster guy, and talking about even a blind man could see it. So he is so intriguing, and the demise of him, it's heroic, but it's still tragic. And the fact that he gets all sliced up by Bernie and what goes down with him, but yet he sets into motion what Tyler is eventually able to do once he comes to and is being dragged through Endworld initially. And Sawyer and his crew, which is like Dale and Doc and Beezer, they're just about to go over. They coat up with the honey, and they go in the black house, and they see the fact that it's just ever growing, and you think there's this many rooms and this many stairways, and then you see multitudes more, and that's because it is most definitely a thinny. It is a way to jump right into End World, and but props to Tyler, man, for the fact that he's gone through so much abuse, and just he's heroically unfazed. He's kind of like the young Jack Sawyer stand-in in this particular story. We don't get as much of him as I would have liked, because we don't really find him until that point in the third act where he's taken from the place where he was being held by Bernie, that cage or whatever, and he's got him driving a golf cart, but yet Bernie is so wounded at that particular point, and Munson has already left his body, and is kind of, because he has to take somebody's vessel over in Earth, essentially, in that particular Earth. And yet when he's over in Endworld, he has his own crazy one-eyed form, which in the thumbnail, I took this artwork from that Grant Deluxe edition. And yet he looks goofy in that photo. I have said there are some great paintings. If you just search Black House artwork, there are some very frightening just creations of the way he is described, with this like white, like almost like alien-y skull kind of thing, and the one eye, and he's very frightening. And but yeah, Bernie, he takes Tyler, chains him up, and he wants to chow down on a bit of him, which is supposed to be his piece and his part. And Tyler heroically just rips his guts open with one hand, and yet has to go through this heroic escape before we get to our big final confrontation. And once again, Straub and King, I know, are big baseball fans, as is apparent by the fact that a baseball bat gets imbued by the power of the talisman that what's his face that Jack Sawyer, the fact that he was able to actually hold the talisman all those years back when he was 12 years old, some of that power still and will forever reside within him. And so for that reason, this baseball bat, he's able to just kind of imbue it with some of the power of the talisman, and he just bashes the brains in of the crazy Munston, and it's a cool bit, but I don't know, it's not quite as rad status. They say King can't write endings. I don't know. I appreciate this one. It's cool, and I dig the fact that he assembles his own little Ka-Tet or posse or whatever, of Dale and the two biker guys and stuff, but. Yeah, it's really more so than anything what Tyler does after it's been made very, very apparent and clear the extent of, crazy telekinetic ability that he has. And those are the types that they need to actually be breakers, because, and most of them, if not pretty much all of them, come from Earth, as opposed to from other worlds, because some breakers, come from other bits, they said, but pretty much all of the telekinetics. And this is why I guess it fits in with the fact that King has written about them so many times in Earth, but which Earth is it? That's the thing. But yes, they come from our world, I guess you would say. And he destroys the area where all of those kids were being held, big combination area. And suddenly, as the Black House has been kind of just sucked from all of its nasty powers, all of these kids, after our posse escapes after rescuing Tyler, it's just there's hundreds upon hundreds of these screaming and laughing and just naked or nearly naked abused kids who have been down there and toiled away, blood on their feet and all this different stuff. That what kind of problem do you think that's going to create in the real world if there's just suddenly hundreds upon hundreds, like over in 750, I think is the number that they toss out at one particular point. And it's interesting. It really, really, truly is. How do you deal with that sort of problem? Well, you blow up Black House, which is what our surviving Ka-Tet, and they all survive, which is kind of interesting. Our guys that all go in together. And they basically just obliterate the place, so there's no sign of evidence. They say Bernie was in there, and they say that there was tons of kids being held hostage, but how could it be that many? So the schematics of it, the actual numbers, they don't add up, but it is what it is. And our posse is hailed as heroes, as they rightfully should. But yet the news outlet bit that we have at the very end before we get into the last bit, the epilogue, is like, this is an unsolved mystery of craziness. And so what, how does this make sense, man? But this is another interesting thing, though, that I have to say. Oh, and it was a joke that I wanted to make. It's the last bit as we're about to wrap things up here, since we're closing in on, well, we're well over an hour at this particular point. But the fact that Bernie, the way he transports himself around, I found myself, because he goes into bathrooms and he like transports himself through the toilet. I couldn't help but think of Tyrone Biggins from Chappelle's Show. And it's that bit where he has the intervention and they're like, found you asleep in my car. He was high on crack. And he's like, how could that be wrong? Because why would I be asleep if I was high on crack? Anyway, he goes into the bathroom in that Chappelle Show sketch and he jumps into the toilet bowl and he just kind of, wiggles around and he goes down, he swirls around and goes down and escapes through the toilet. The fact that he's such a rotten piece of crap, I guess it kind of makes sense that that's how, through the power of Gorg and and Munchen, that's how he would be able to do it, is by transporting himself through the toilet. But Bernie are just otherworldly imbued bit of nastiness, who was already a sick son of a bitch beforehand, doing the most dastardly, disgusting things, but just the ante was upped significantly. And yes, the toilet transportation, I would be remiss if I had forgotten to make that particular joke. But yeah, so very similar to what King does as we're about to close things up. Near the very end of this book, King does something along with Straub in this case, so I'm not sure whose idea this was. Maybe if it was Straub's, maybe King carried it over into near the end of Dark Tower 7 for that reason. I don't know. But there's a point where, with maybe like 20-something pages left, 20, 30 pages left, our narrator says, well, you can stop here because you might not necessarily like what happens if you proceed forward, so on. The exact same thing without spoiling, because I'm not trying to spoil 5, 6, and 7 of the Dark Tower here. I have not done any of that. I've given maybe the tiniest hint or reference or something, but nothing that's going to spoil. But it is definitely something that King does once again in Dark Tower 7 near the very end of the book. And then you proceed into this like epilogue sort of situation. I don't know. King is very big on his foreshadowing, and he'll say, and he even says it here. He's like, Jack Sawyer has no idea that he's about to die, and it's verbatim. That's not word for word, so to speak. But there's the huge press conference, and our heroes are being recognized and everything. And so I'm just going to get a little water after an hour plus of just talk a lot. But yeah, so they're about to be recognized, and there's this big press conference, and everything's all cool and crazy. But yeah, there's the immediate just revelation even before it happens that Jack Sawyer is about to be killed. And lo and behold, this woman who was the husband of this guy that Jack had taken down way back, like how far are we talking? How far back? Way back, and it goes a little something like this. Yeah. Way back in LA all those years ago. And so this woman, Wendy something, if I remember correctly, inconsequential. The fact that she goes up and just shoots him, and she's tackled and beaten nearly to death. But yeah, just as our heroes are triumphant. It's always like the universe, and the call works in both ways, right? And it's just kind of evens things out, so to speak, the random and the purpose. And this woman was most def the random in that regard. And yeah, so he's on the verge of death, but lo and behold, guess who was there chilling out? None other than Parkas. And so Parkas rushes up and grabs him and takes him over to the territories, because that's one of the only places where, he's shot in like the lungs and the, heart and all this stuff. So he's pretty much like, he is just about to die, like straight up about to die. And sorry, notifications, they drive me crazy. But yeah, so he's basically on the verge of death, and the only way that he could potentially be saved is if he is taken over by Parkas, which is indeed what happens. And he's on the same bed that he saw the Queen of the Territories way back when he was 12 dying. He ends up in the same bed, and there's no indication as to whether he is or is not going to make it. But Parkas does explain to Sophia, that even if he does recover over here, I like the analogy that Parkas makes here, and the fact that he's like, how there's some creatures, that they can breathe both on land and underwater. And there's also those that breathe underwater and then they gain the evolutionary ability, obviously, to, crawl up on land and survive up there. He's like, there's also some that they survive on one way, but they kind of, once they've spent too much time someplace or they get wounded or whatever, they revert back to being only able to live in one particular place. And that's what he fears has happened with Jack. Whereas if he does recover, yeah, maybe he can go back over there, to his world, but he wouldn't be able to last very long because his old wounds would reopen, because just the magic and the wonder and the abilities just would not transfer over anymore. And in fact, the only reason that he was able to jump back and flip back over to the territories and survive in the first place was because of the fact that he had touched the talisman. Otherwise, no dice, he would not have been able to just get past those sort of wounds. And so it's fascinating, but I do have to say, at the very end, which I find relatively cool, and this is in there even after the little territories bit, the epilogue that we have right here. And this is none other than his lady Sophie, and she's sitting there with him. She sits by his bed on the first night of full Earth moon, 10 days after her conversation with Parkas in the secret passageway. Outside the pavilion, she can hear children singing the green corn adio. On her lap is a scrap of embroidery. It is summer, still summer, and the air is sweet with summer's mystery. And in this billowing room where his mother's twinner once lay, Jack Sawyer opens his eyes. Sophie lays aside her embroidery, leans forward, and puts her lips soft against the shell of his ear. Welcome back, my heart, my love. My heart, my life, and my love. Welcome back. It's very beautiful in that regard. I do love, even though it's not as developed as I would have liked, because it is like it's a love at first sight, and they don't really get any time after that, but often that connection can be enough, and it just lies dormant, and if they ever get the chance to reconnect. And so this does imply that they do, and that's why there's so much clamoring for a third Jack Sawyer book, and who knows if we will ever see it. Fingers firmly crossed that we will. Because they even say in the little palaver at the very end, when he's on the deathbed in the pavilion, and there is that discussion where in the dark behind the chamber in which Jack Sawyer sleeps, Parker answers, okay, this is the bit that I actually wanted to show. Why must that, okay, let's get to this, all right. You must help him, dear. I love him, and he loves you. But what's coming will be difficult. Why must that be, Parkas? And this is the line that I really like. Why must life always demand so much and give so little? He draws her into his arms, and she goes willingly, her face pressed against his chest. In the dark behind the chamber in which Jack Sawyer sleeps, Parkas answers her question with a simple word, Ka. So yeah, why must life always demand so much and give so little? Ka. And that's because, Ka's destiny, obviously. Ka is a path, but yet it's not always good, it's not always evil. It is, in fact, that random and the purpose. It is the combination of both. And I find that so incredibly fascinating and philosophical. King is never one to shy away from that. And so, yes, we can, based on the way that this ends, get a third Jack Sawyer book. And if I had my way, especially with what Parkas hints at, and especially with how the tower ends, without spoiling things, we know that the wheel turns and turns again and turns again. And how many times it's turned in the journey of Roland, we don't necessarily know. But he did not have the horn of Eld at the very end. That's why the movie was going to be such a big thing, because King even tweeted out, look what Roland finally has. Check it out, suckers. And so maybe another turn of the wheel brings us to the point where Jack Sawyer actually gets to assist in, because they hint at the fact that mayhap he will, mayhap he won't actually have a part in, just Roland and his new Ka-Tet and being able to stop the Crimson King and, save the tower and everything like that. So maybe a final turn of the wheel can in fact happen, and Jack Sawyer can be a part of helping out with that. I think that would be badass, because especially in Black House, he is basically implied to be a gunslinger himself, or at least, it seems like one, whether it's the final confrontation in Endworld when they kill Homeboy, or even earlier on where he first meets Sophie and they're having the palaver with Parkas. That's what I would like to see, maybe sprinkle in some Battle of Jericho Hill and, so on and so forth. But hey, that's just me as a Tower junkie, just wanting to have my cake and eat it too. I'm going to see what some of these final comments said. On a side note, I have to say, Henry is one of my favorite characters King has written. I think he created his different personas, given his work in the radio industry and his love for rock and roll, damn right. And also for, old school jazz and blues and stuff like that, most definitely. And love how a blind man has the best fashion in the book. Plus, I love how Henry signs his mail under the name Joe Strummer. Yeah, super, super cool. Matt says, you're awesome, Fuego. Love the horror show. We appreciate that so very much. Jake Corento says, I actually read this before the Talisman. I prefer it. Love the stuff with the bikers. Yeah, that's the thing. There is some, I'm not so big into Dale or any of the law enforcement or a few others, but the Henry and the bikers especially, I think, are some of King's just best written characters. They're virtuous, and yet they're super cool, and they're complex, and they really made the book for me a lot more so on this particular read. Joe Esposito says, greetings, Jaime. I'm an avid King reader, but I haven't gotten to the Talisman yet. I hear nothing but bad things. What good is there to say about it without spoiling it? I love the Talisman, Joe. I truly do. I'm not going to say it's a YA, but it's most definitely it's kids, fantasy adventure versus or young adult fantasy adventure, I would say, versus The Black House, which is an adult gritty crime horror story. But I love the whimsy. I love the adventure aspect of it. I like those sort of young adventure stories. It draws a lot of inspiration from the Mark Twain stuff, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, and yet King putting his own spin on it. I personally very much recommend the Talisman. I know the difference in prose between Straub and King can be a little jarring at times, but I personally find it a thrilling adventure. Wolf, right here and now. I love his character. So yeah, I truly recommend the Talisman, but don't go in expecting hardcore horror from King. It's very much in the more complex. It's a more complex version and less, and obviously not medieval version, aside from a few aspects of Eyes of the Dragon. So if you've read Eyes of the Dragon, just think of a more adventure, less medieval. I don't know. It's a hodgepodge of so many different just aspects. I love the Talisman, whereas Black House, at this point, I would probably contend that I love it too. So this reread was incredibly enjoying. A third Jack Sawyer book and another Dark Tower book are my must-wants. Amen to that. And, if we can't have both, I say, throw them both together and have those stories finally properly interlock, because they truly did in this one, most def. Long live the horror show and its great professional crew and host. Well, obviously, shout out to Cecil, the founder of The Feast here, and for giving me this outlet and this opportunity to present my King coverage. I am humbled and honored by all of y'all jumping in, saying what's up, giving some thoughts and insight. And Black House is a rad status book that I most definitely recommend everybody. And since we're right about at the 90-minute mark, I think it's time to reveal the August book of the month. Now, some are going to find this interesting. Some may be like, what? What are you doing that for? Why isn't it Billy Summers? Well, Billy Summers, I am attempting to get finished by tomorrow to have a non-spoilers review up. So that is the plan for tomorrow, to cruise through that bad boy, get it finished. And it's already been briefly started. Not going to discuss anything just yet. But the August book of the month is tied in with another book. These are twinner books, and these twinner books are going to be both the August and September books because of the fact that they are celebrating 25-year anniversaries. And so previously, I read Desperation before I read The Regulators. However, this time, I think I need to do it in the opposite order. And I haven't read these books, and it's probably it's way longer than even Black House, man, because I read everything King in published order over a span of about 7.5 years. And we're even like 3 years removed from that now, guys. So it has been a long time since I read The Regulators, and I felt like I should read them in the opposite order to see what sort of just different perspective that I can get, because for those who are the uninitiated, there are characters that are in both, but since they're twinnerverses, it's a completely different setting. I believe one is Ohio and then the other one is Nevada, and there are completely different fates, motivations. Some characters that live in one die in the other, and vice versa. And they're also drastically different in tone. With this being a Bachman book, the last Bachman book proper that King wrote. Now, granted, Blaze came after, but Blaze was actually written long before Regulators and so on. So I think it was even written before Thinner, now that I think about it. But long story short, I want to read them in opposite order. So the book of the month for August, and shout out to my homeboy Rob, out to my ginger Irish homie out there, who's such a big fan of the Regulators and also Desperation, which is back there on the shelf. Yeah, right up there. Yeah, Georgie is right on top of him, which is fun. But yes, so for August, it's going to be Bachman, the Regulators, and then for September, this is one of the few times that I'm just letting this out of the bag beforehand. Desperation is going to be the September book. So that's going to do it for the proceedings, everybody. That's right. So once again, Richard Bachman for August with the Regulators. And then thanks so very much, everybody, for tuning in to hearing me talk about Black House. And now, before I forget, I can finally get around to reading A Little Silver Book. This was a screenplay that Richard Chismar and Jonathan Shack? I don't know. I can't pronounce the last name properly. But they actually wrote a screenplay for Black House. Never was adapted, but it's going to be my first time checking this out. I've had this for a number of months, but I wanted to wait until I reread Black House so that I had proper context of comparison, just to see what's changed, what's omitted. I wanted it to be really, really fresh in my mind. And so look forward to that, everybody. But yes, Jake says, great stuff as usual. Love watching you spit King knowledge. Well, I appreciate the palaver with all of y'all. And Francis Chainsaw Grim says, greetings. Unfortunately, Francis, we've been going for almost 90 minutes and we are just about to cut it out, pull the plug on the proceedings. But yes, everybody, I extend a grande gracias. I've been Jaime and Fuego. You can find more on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on YouTube. And a like, a share, a subscribe for this video means a hell of a lot. Cecil Laird and myself are just about to, well, in a couple hours, we are going to be seeing an advanced screening of none other than The Suicide Squad. Not to get confused with that crappiness that David Ayer had basically Frankenstein from what he was originally trying to do. I still want that Ayer cut. We got a Snyder cut. I want to see a goddamn Ayer cut because, man, that Suicide Squad movie, no bueno, man. No bueno. And yet this new one that is coming out, R-rated from James Gunn, I am so stoked. And so Cecil Laird and I will be reviewing that this evening. And I'm not sure if we're going to put it up to I guess we'll see, because I'm trying to get Billy Summers done for tomorrow as well. So you guys are getting a double dose of Hail to Stephen King this week, which is incredibly exciting for me. So once again, happy new Stephen King book. Happy Billy Summers Day, everybody. Happy readings with that. Definitely within the next month, check out Bachman, The Regulators. And yeah, until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, sen amigos, constant readers and viewers alike. Say thank you. I hope we share more of this palaver sooner rather than later, and that we have been well met. And until that instance occurs, remember to stay scared and read Stephen King. I think I love this book now, man. Black House is the shit. All right, y'all. I will do my best to keep up the good work, and I appreciate the kind words, Francis. And to everybody who took a little bit out of your days to spend some time with moi, I am say thank you. Supremely appreciated. And I will see y'all next. Well, see y'all tomorrow, presumably. So, adios.